everybody, and welcome back to Badgerland Journal Stories of Wisconsin. I am your host, Abby Alcox, back at you with another episode. And today, I have timed this fairly well, because this is actually the anniversary of the event we are going to be talking about. So November 10th. So anyone know what happened in Wisconsin history on November 10th? Nobody? Maybe you're answering me, but I can't hear you because this is a one-way conversation. But on November 10th, 1975, the SS Edmund Fitzgerald sank in Lake Superior. I know, crazy. Abby's doing another shipwreck. But this one's actually kind of interesting because most of the shipwrecks that we've talked about so far on the podcast have all occurred in the early 1920s or before that. And the Edmund Fitzgerald sinking happened in 1975 when we think technology is better. We have sonar, we have radios, we have a lot more information. So how did this ship sink? Well, I'm maybe going to give you an answer. Maybe not. It's not exactly a determined fact of how it sank. But I'll give you some different options of how people think it may have. But before we get into that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the SS Edmund Fitzgerald, hereby going to be called the Fitzgerald because I'm not going to say that name every single time I refer to the ship. But the Fitzgerald was created by Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And it was the Great Lakes Engineering Works in Michigan that created this bulk carrier. So a lot of the ships we've been talking about were schooners, so kind of just smaller cargo ships. No, this was a very, very large cargo carrier. And it was named after the president and chairman of Northwestern Mutual's board. And his wife is actually the one who christened the Edmund Fitzgerald. And this was actually the first of insurance companies to own a freighter like this. So to give you a little perspective on how big this ship was, it was 729 feet long and 13,632 tons heavy. That's with it empty. That's not with cargo on it. And it was the largest ship in the Great Lakes up until 1971. So for 13 years after it was christened, this was the largest ship that was on the Great Lakes, kind of roaming around. And if you are all I can't really put into perspective how long 729 feet are, it's about 1/8 of a mile long, which is pretty big for a ship. And so its first voyage was in September of 1958, and it would set 6 different records, carrying the heaviest load of its time. So it kept setting these records of having the heaviest load. And it had made over 748 round trips during its time on the Great Lakes. And its normal path usually was between Silver Bay, Minnesota to Detroit or Toledo. And it was usually carrying taconite to steel mills. And we'll talk about what taconite is because that's what it was carrying the day it sank. And it usually just would return empty. So taconite, I brought it up, is kind of these small marble-sized iron ore. And if you believe my father, which I would, he says they make fantastic slingshot ammunition because apparently taconite used to go through where he grew up, and as kids they would go and pick up the different taconite pebbles to then shoot at each other, which I'm sure was a little bit painful when you got at it. But on November 9th, 1975, the Fitzgerald was once again transporting these taconite pellets or pebbles or whatever you want to call them from Superior, Wisconsin to Zug Island in Detroit, Michigan. And I just think it's funny that there's an island named Zug. Something tells me it's not like a vacation island. there was 26,116 tons of these taconite pebbles, or pellets, not pebbles, they're pellets, from Wisconsin to Michigan. And the Fitzgerald was captained by Ernest McSorley. And McSorley had 40 years of experience under his belt. He was not an inexperienced captain. In fact, he was in charge of 9 other ships before the Fitzgerald, and he was planning on retiring at the end of this season. And his men came from Michigan, Minnesota, Ohio, Wisconsin, so all over the Midwest. And I believe there's 29 of them total. And so they loaded up the ship with these iron ore pellets. And this would have been the 40th journey for that year, and its 17th year of service. And so they left at 2:39 p.m., and they were shortly followed by Arthur M. Anderson. The Arthur M. Anderson. It's a name, but it's the name of the ship. So it had departed Two Harbors, Minnesota, which wasn't too far from Superior, Wisconsin. So they were within 10 to 15 miles of each other. And so we will see during this entire journey, they are in pretty much constant communication with each other. Maybe not every minute, but they're talking, letting each other know. They're kind of sailing together, a little bit of a buddy system going on. And so they together, so the Anderson was captained by Bernie Cooper, who was another very experienced ship captain on the Great Lakes. So as they begin their journey, the November storm starts to kind of stir up. And it's nothing crazy, but together they decide that they are going to depart from the normal path ships take across Lake Superior. And they want to take a more northern kind of path around Lake Superior. And the reason they were doing this is they were hoping that the highlands from the Canadian shore would offer some protection from the storm and from the wind. And so they then begin turning southeast, hoping to shelter at Whitefish Point. And the conditions start to get worse, and then a gale warning is issued at 7 p.m. And so this is kind of a warning, like conditions are not good for sailing. It's high, kind of dangerous weather. And both the captains continue on since they were used to these conditions. It wasn't nice sailing weather, but they were used to sailing through storms. They were larger ships, so they thought they could weather it. So I'm sure that was not the first time they'd gone on in a storm. But they continue on into the afternoon of November 10th. So remember, they started sailing in the afternoon of the 9th. And so now we're to the afternoon of November 10th. Conditions are still not that great. So the Fitzgerald had just passed Mishippicoten. We're going with that island, which is an island off of Canada, and was passing Caribou Island. And so right in this area is what is called the 6 Fathom Shoal. And so, again, shoals are where the water gets a lot shallower, and so then there's a danger for ships possibly scraping bottom, kind of getting beached, being unable to move, when you have like dangerously shallow water like that. At this time, Captain Cooper of the Anderson swears that he sees the Fitzgerald kind of turn around this shoal too close. He believes at this moment that the ship hit that shoal. And we really don't know for sure if this happened, because obviously he is quite a few miles behind him, but he thinks that he came too close to this shoal. So he thinks at this moment there's a very good chance that there was damage done to the Fitzgerald. And conditions are getting worse, and Captain Cooper loses sight of the Fitzgerald, but according to his radar, it's just 17 miles ahead of them. And then at 3:30, so not too long after, he swears that he sees the ship go too close to that shoal. Captain McSorley radios the Anderson. And he says, "Anderson, this is the Fitzgerald. I have a fence rail down, 2 vents are lost or damaged, and a list. I'm checking down. Will you stay by me till I get to Whitefish Bay?" So he clearly took some sort of damage, whether that was from the shoal or other things that were happening in the storm. We have no way of knowing. But McSorley starts to slow down, so then the Anderson can start to catch up to him and be behind him at a safe distance, and radio communication continues on throughout this. And just for some perspective, because you might think, like, well, why didn't he, get off the ship right now? This is not the first time the Fitzgerald had been damaged. It had run aground before, it had hit lock walls, it had hit other freighters, and none of them were so serious to take the Fitzgerald out of commission. Obviously, once they got to port, these issues had to be addressed. But at this time, I think McSorley truly believed he was going to make it to Whitefish Bay in Michigan. From this point on, we know for sure that the Fitzgerald was taking some water. And again, you might be going, they were sinking at this moment. But a lot of these big ships had pumps, which were working at that time to try and get the water out of the hull of the ship. But the water was kind of coming in as fast as it was being pumped out, which was definitely an issue. But at this point, if they could just maintain the level, if they could get enough water out to kind of keep that water at a minimum, and they could get to Whitefish Bay, again, they would be able to survive or to keep going. The ship wouldn't be ruined. And so at 4:10, the Fitzgerald lost their radar, so the ability to kind of see where they were, see other ships. And so the Anderson once again came within 10 miles to kind of provide guidance because their radar was still working. And at 5:20, a huge wave smashed the lifeboats on the Andersons. So on the kind of accompanying ship, the lifeboats are no longer working. They are not usable. And at 6:55, the boat lurched and a huge wave engulfed the vessel, and then another wave hit it immediately. This is a quote from, I believe, Captain Cooper. But he says that the Anderson had just raised up and shook herself off of all of the water, and then baroof, just like a big dog, another wave, just like the first one, or bigger, hit us again. I watched those 2 waves headed down the lake towards the Fitzgerald, and I think those were the 2 that sent him under. So he kind of thinks that those waves maybe helped to push the ship under. I don't know for sure if those 2 waves were the only reason, nor do I think Cooper thinks that's the only 2 reasons, but that may have been kind of the catalyst for the Fitzgerald going down. And we will talk a little bit more of that at the end when I talk about the different kind of theories of why this giant ship went down. So another issue at this point is the Whitefish Point beacons were not working and therefore couldn't have warned ships if they were getting too close, although we do know that Anderson was kind of providing that guidance, and at no time, at least while the Fitzgerald was up, was it getting too close to the shore. At 7:10, there's the last communication between the Anderson and the Fitzgerald, and McSorley was asked, how are you guys doing? And he says, we're holding our own. He's not maybe panicking. I mean, I'm sure at this point it's stressful, but I don't think he had any indication that that would be the last time he was talking to the Anderson. He gave no evidence of panic. So at this time, like I said, nothing seemed any worse than before. And at 7:15, 5 minutes later, the ship blipped off the radar. So the Anderson could no longer see this giant freighter on the radar. At 7:22, they start trying to attempt radio communication. The reason maybe you're like, why didn't they start right when the radar went off? But at this time, because of the storm, there's a lot of interference. And so it wasn't odd for kind of the radar to go dark momentarily. But after, 7 minutes of nothing returning, they start trying to radio just to confirm, like, maybe their radar just had gone out. After all, the Fitzgerald, their radar had also gone out. And there's no answer. They then attempt to radio other boats that are on, or ships that are on Lake Superior, trying to see, like, has anyone heard from the Fitzgerald? Has anyone, seen them? Like, do we have any, like, contact with them? When no one can hear from the Fitzgerald, they start trying to contact the Coast Guard. But the Coast Guard, it's a, really bad storm on Lake Michigan. So they were out trying to locate a 16-foot boat and bring them in. So they weren't able to contact them at that time. By 8 o'clock, the Anderson had made it to Whitefish Bay in Michigan, and they were safely docked in the harbor. And again, he has contacted the Coast Guard and gotten a hold of them this time. And so they were out searching, and then the Coast Guard comes back to Cooper, and he says, "We need you to go out. We need you to go back into this storm and try and help find if there's any, survivors, if there's any remains of the ship, if it truly went down, we need more people out here." And so Anderson at first goes, no. He even made a comment, like, at this point, it's very likely you have one ship at the bottom of the Lake Superior. If I go back out, there might be two. But he thought about it, and he returns out on the lake trying to search for survivors. And the Anderson is not the only ship the Coast Guard tries to make this request with. There were 7 other ships in Whitefish Bay at this point, and they were all asked, "Can you please come out and help with the search?" And only one other ship agreed, and that was the William Clay Ford. They too initially said, "No, we're not going back out in this storm. It's too dangerous for me and for my crew." And the captain went down into his chambers, and he sat there and he thought about it, and he changed his mind. And he went out to try and search for the Fitzgerald. And I think, I don't know these men, I don't know their thoughts, but my guess is, if that was them and their crew, they would want someone out looking for them too, And so I think that probably influenced those 2 ships to go back and try and find the Fitzgerald and if there were any survivors. The Anderson will find 2 of the lifeboats and other debris from the Fitzgerald, but there are absolutely no survivors that they found. And if you see the lifeboats, these weren't like, I'd say functioning lifeboats. They were torn to pieces. It clearly did not look like people had been on them. So the Coast Guard starts to launch an HU-16 aircraft, and they request that 2 cutters, the Naugatuck and the Woodruck, come to Whitefish Bay to try and help with this search. The Naugatuck will come at 12:45, and the Woodrush will only come on November 14th. This would be about 4 days later. It had arrived from Duluth, Minnesota, but again, the conditions on the lake were not good at this point. And Canada's Coast Guard, because this is very close to the border, also assisted in the search for the Fitzgerald. On November 11th at 1 a.m., they fly in helicopters to see if they can see any more of that debris. And on November 14th, which is when the conditions really cleared up, there was a huge search, including like a magnetic anomaly detectors, which detected a disturbance 17 miles north of Whitefish Bay. And so they were able to, detect there's something down there. They used sonar and discovered that there were 2 large pieces at the bottom of Lake Superior. They once again repeated this to confirm their results on November 22nd and 25th. And so, by all means, this is the Fitzgerald. Like, they're just trying to confirm it at this point. So it was at the bottom of Lake Superior in 2 broken pieces. So then, the next spring, the Woodrush returns in May 1976. using sonar for a third time, and they actually use underwater recovery vehicles at this time. And they were able to take 43,000 feet of video and 900 photos of the wreck of the Fitzgerald. In May 20th, 1976, it was absolutely confirmed through images of the stern that this was the Edmund Fitzgerald at the bottom of Lake Superior. And it ended up being 535 feet below the surface of the lake. The Fitzgerald then lost its entire crew of 29 men that evening on November 10th, 1975. And so, as I mentioned, it is located only 17 miles northwest of Whitefish Point, so it wouldn't have taken them too much longer to get to the coast had they been able to make it. There would be 3 more expeditions down to the wreckage in 1989, 1994, and 1995 to see the wreck. There's a 200-pound bronze bell that was on the Edmund Fitzgerald, and so at the request of the family, this bell was recovered from the wreckage to become a memorial. And so they actually now have the bell displayed at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum in Whitefish Bay. And they even went as far as to create a different bell to replace the one they took from the wreckage. And the one that they put into the wreckage after removing the original is engraved with all of the names of the men who lost their lives on the Edmund Fitzgerald. And then the bell was rung 29 times to represent the 29 men lost. One kind of, we'll talk about it. There's a very famous song about the shipwreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. But one thing to note is none of the bodies of the men were ever recovered. And there's kind of the saying that Lake Superior never gives up her dead. And this is actually because the lake is so cold. So most bodies, when they die, they float due to bacteria that causes the bloating. This is getting a little bit more morbid, which is one of my favorite podcasts. They're never going to listen to this because, you know, they're not from Wisconsin, but woot to them. But the bloating causes them to float. However, because of the very cold temperatures of Lake Superior, it never really gets too far above like 36 degrees Fahrenheit, at least at the bottom of the lake. Bacteria can't grow, therefore cannot cause the bloating, therefore do not float. And so the bodies of the men still remain with the shipwreck today. This also keeps the wreck itself intact today. So you can't dive down there because I believe it is under Canadian control of the water. But they do not want people going down and trying to dive into this wreck. But if you were, it'd be in pretty good condition. So going back to what caused the Fitzgerald to sink, because there is some questions. The Coast Guard came up with their own answers. Captains who were on the lake that day disagree. Cooper disagrees. So we're going to talk about some of the different pieces, and if you want my opinion, I think that it's likely a mixture of all of these things. I think in a way it was the perfect storm for the Fitzgerald to go down. So the Coast Guard came up with the opinion, and no one, okay, and we'll give everyone this. No one says they can conclusively determine what caused the Fitzgerald to go down. So no one's claiming to know it for sure, but people are claiming opinions. The Coast Guard's opinion is that the Fitzgerald lost buoyancy due to flooding in the cargo caused by ineffective hatch closure. So it's a cargo ship. To kind of prevent water from coming in, you have to kind of clamp these hatches shut, and they argued that complacency was the cause of the ships going down, that these men had been on the water for so long, they didn't pay proper attention to kind of these hatch closures, caused the water to come in over the course of the day. Then at just, maybe one of those waves hit them, and they just went down due to loss of buoyancy. So yeah, they think that it flooded gradually throughout the day and would have sunk quickly without warning. So they wouldn't have even known how much water was in the hull of the ship until it was too late. Cooper believes that the ship either bottomed out or had a stress fracture at the shoal, so caused, kind of irreversible damage to the ship. Again, he thinks that from that moment that it hit the shoal, it was sinking from then on. He thinks that was kind of the divisive cause. The reason people get kind of defensive about the Coast Guard one is because these hatches weighed a ton. These weren't like just little light hatches that would kind of fly up. So a different captain who was on the lake that day said, even if they didn't, close this properly, he didn't think that much water would have come into the hull to cause it to sink. He thought there had to be other things going on. And so then there's also kind of the theory of the three sisters, and no, three witchy sisters didn't curse the ship or anything, but it's the idea that when there's a really bad storm, that you kind of have these three ginormous waves that can cause a ship to go down. So it's the idea that the first wave sends an enormous amount of water onto the deck that it isn't able to fully shake off. And then the second and the third wave add additional water, overloading the deck and causing it to sink. And this theory could be very much true. We know for sure that two very large waves hit the Anderson and were kind of headed towards the Fitzgerald shortly before it went down. But whether or not this was the sole cause, it could have also just, compounded already existing damage on the ship, which we know that the Fitzgerald had sustained some damage at this time. The Lake Carriers Association specifically disagreed with the Coast Guard's assessment. They were in line with Captain Cooper's assessment that complacency was not the cause of the ship going down. Instead, it was very likely the ship had received damage in the shoal area, had bottomed out, had a fracture, and that from that point on they were sinking. And so there's still multiple theories that are debated today. Was it the bow that was likely submerged by like a quick, powerful force, so kind of a wave causing it to go down and just kind of sink? When did the Fitzgerald break in two? Like, did the waves cause that, or when it hit the floor was it broken? There's kind of just questions. And I remember in an interview I watched, Cooper had said, he thought that they didn't know they were going down. It had to be so quickly that the ship was underwater that they couldn't have known what was happening. Because he said, we were right there. We were in communication, which I think is really what makes this so intriguing to everyone, is why did it go down so quickly? Not necessarily. There were clearly things that had caused it damage, but how did it go down so quickly? There wasn't time for an SOS call, for a Mayday call. And that's why I think Cooper supports that idea of those waves hitting them, because he kind of was like, I think they thought they were getting hit with a wave, and before they realized, like, it wasn't a wave, they were already under. You know what I mean? Because some of these waves were like 40 to 50 feet tall. They were washing over the ship. And so, whether or not we will ever know the answer, we probably won't. It'll be one of the great mysteries of the Great Lakes. But the Edmund Fitzgerald today is still one of the largest ships to have sunk in the Great Lakes. And Gordon Lightfoot wrote a song called The Shipwreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, which, people my age probably don't know. I listened to it, I think, once in high school when I took a Wisconsin history class. Shout out to Mr. Soki for, inspiring some of these. And then I think today and yesterday when I was doing research on this podcast. So if I should maybe start making a list of all of the songs I recommend or are somehow connected to a podcast episode that I am doing. but Great Lakes Brewing Company also have an Edmund Fitzgerald Porter. And you can get, I don't even know the price. I was going to say for the low, low price. I don't know what it is. Legos are never that cheap, so probably not that low of a price. But you can get a Lego SS Edmund Fitzgerald kit. So, if anyone's like, ooh, you've hit a sweet spot, you can go check out those things and, partake in some more Edmund Fitzgerald culture. But that's really all I have, If you want, let me know on our Facebook, Instagram, or an email what you think caused the Edmund Fitzgerald to go down. I also am very curious. You guys will have to let me know, what's your favorite Shipwreck, that episode that we've done so far? Because I know we did the Christmas tree ship. I talked about the pirate Dan Seavey, and he had a couple of ships go down. I talked about Death's Door, so I had a couple of shipwrecks there. Now I talked about the Edmund Fitzgerald. Let me know what your favorite story is, and why, on our Facebook, Instagram, or email, which is Facebook at Badgerland Journal, Stories of Wisconsin, Instagram, Badgerland Journal, and then our Gmail is badgerlandjournal@gmail.com. Woohoo! Alright, thank you guys for listening, and we will see you next time.